A harsh wind sweeps across the hills of Canaan as tension builds within Abram's household. A tension born not from external enemies or regional conflict, but from the fragile relationships that shape life inside a growing clan. Sarai watches the passing of years with increasing frustration. Her hopes for a child fading as time stretches on without the fulfillment of the promise she has carried. Hagar, an Egyptian servant brought into the household during their time in the Nile Valley, becomes the center of a decision that will alter the course of history, a decision rooted in ancient customs, social expectations, and the desperate desire to secure an heir. When Hagar conceives, the balance of power within the household shifts, creating a fracture that widens with each passing day as resentment, pride, and vulnerability collide in a space too small to contain them. The conflict escalates until Hagar flees into the wilderness, carrying her unborn child into a landscape defined by danger, isolation, and the unforgiving heat of the desert. There, at a remote spring along an ancient trade route, she encounters a moment that will shape nations and echo across generations. The mystery that emerges from this moment is not only why Hagar fled, but whether the details preserved in the narrative align with what archaeology, ancient social structures, and desert geography reveal about the early Second Millennium BC. Please like this video to help support evidence-based Bible documentaries. With the emotional tension set and the wilderness unfolding, we now turn to the first major discovery that illuminates the social conflict and power dynamics behind Hagar's flight. Evidence 1. The discovery. The first major discovery emerges from the study of ancient Near Eastern household structures, social hierarchies, and fertility customs, revealing that the conflict between Sarai and Hagar reflects real cultural dynamics that shaped family life in the early Second Millennium BC. Archaeological and textual evidence from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant shows that servants, particularly those acquired through trade or migration, often played complex roles within elite households, serving not only as laborers but as potential surrogates in cases where the primary wife was unable to conceive. This practice is documented in multiple ancient texts, including the Nuzi Tablets, which describe arrangements in which a servant woman could bear a child on behalf of her mistress, with the child legally belonging to the household rather than the servant. These records matter because they demonstrate that Sarai's decision to give Hagar to Abram reflects a culturally coherent strategy rooted in the legal and social norms of the time, rather than a symbolic or isolated act. The tension that arises after Hagar conceives aligns with documented patterns in ancient households, where the status of a servant who bore a child for her mistress could shift dramatically, creating friction, rivalry, and power struggles that threaten the stability of the household. Anthropological studies reveal that pregnancy elevated a woman's social standing, especially when she carried the potential heir of a prominent household, which explains why Hagar's attitude toward Sarai becomes a source of conflict. The narrative's depiction of Sarai responding with anger and vulnerability reflects the emotional and social pressures placed on women in ancient societies, where fertility was closely tied to identity, honor, and long-term security. The decision to send Hagar away aligns with documented practices in which household leaders attempted to resolve internal conflict by removing the source of tension, especially when the social hierarchy became unstable. Archaeological evidence from Middle Bronze Age settlements reveals that servants and lower-status individuals often lived in liminal spaces within households, their positions secure only as long as they maintained harmony with the primary family members. When conflict arose, these individuals could be expelled, reassigned, or forced to flee, reflecting a pattern that aligns with Hagar's departure. The significance of this discovery becomes even clearer when we consider the broader cultural context of Abram's household, which included individuals from multiple regions, backgrounds, and social levels, creating a complex environment in which identity, loyalty, and hierarchy were constantly negotiated. The convergence of household archaeology, fertility customs, and social anthropology reveals that the conflict between Sarai and Hagar reflects authentic cultural dynamics rooted in the realities of ancient Near Eastern life. If you're finding this fascinating, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next investigation. With the social conflict established, we now turn to evidence that illuminates Hagar's flight into the wilderness and the geography that shaped her journey. Evidence 2. The confirmation. The second major discovery emerges from the study of ancient desert geography, trade routes, and survival patterns, revealing that Hagar's flight into the wilderness reflects a historically grounded journey, shaped by the environmental realities of the region and the established pathways that connected Canaan to Egypt. The narrative describes Hagar fleeing toward the wilderness of Shur, a region located along the northeastern edge of the Sinai Peninsula. Known in ancient texts as a corridor used by travelers, merchants, and migrants moving between Egypt and the Levant. Archaeological surveys of this region have uncovered evidence of ancient roads, watering points, and desert installations that align with the route Hagar would have taken, demonstrating that her journey reflects a real geographical landscape rather than a symbolic or imagined wilderness. The mention of a spring along the way to Shur aligns with documented water sources used by travelers crossing the desert, including wells, springs, and seasonal pools that provided essential resources for survival in an environment where dehydration, heat exposure, and isolation posed constant threats. These water sources were often located near trade routes or natural depressions in the landscape, making them critical points of refuge for individuals fleeing danger or seeking passage between regions. The significance of this detail becomes even more compelling when we consider that the spring described in the narrative is situated along a known migration corridor used by Egyptians traveling northward, suggesting that Hagar, as an Egyptian servant, may have instinctively followed a familiar route toward her homeland. Environmental studies of the Sinai region revealed that the desert's harsh conditions would have made Hagar's journey extremely dangerous, especially for a pregnant woman traveling alone, highlighting the desperation and urgency behind her flight. The presence of ancient inscriptions and archaeological remains along the Shur corridor further illuminates the historical context of the region, revealing that it served as a boundary zone between Egyptian territory and the lands to the northeast, a place where travelers recorded their journeys, armies marched, and refugees sought passage. The narrative's depiction of Hagar encountering a divine message at a desert spring aligns with ancient literary patterns in which significant revelations occur at liminal spaces, particularly at water sources located in remote or transitional regions. These locations often served as symbolic thresholds between danger and safety, despair and hope, or isolation and intervention, reflecting a cultural understanding of the desert as both a place of threat and a place of transformation. The convergence of desert geography, trade route archaeology, and environmental analysis reveals that Hagar's flight reflects a real and historically grounded journey shaped by the physical landscape of the ancient Near East. Do you have anything to add to the conversation? Please add your voice to the comments below. With the wilderness context established, we now turn to the final and most revealing piece of evidence that illuminates the archaeological and cultural convergence behind the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Evidence 3. The revelation. The final and most compelling piece of evidence emerges from the archaeological discoveries associated with Egyptian servitude, Middle Bronze Age cultural practices, and the settlement patterns that shaped the regions connected to Hagar and Ishmael, revealing a landscape that aligns closely with the world described in the narrative. Excavations in Egypt have uncovered extensive evidence of household structures that included foreign servants, particularly individuals acquired through trade, migration, or political alliances, demonstrating that Hagar's presence in Abram's household reflects a well-attested cultural pattern. Egyptian servants often retained aspects of their cultural identity, including language, customs, and personal names, which aligns with the narrative's depiction of Hagar as an Egyptian woman navigating life within a foreign household. The significance of Hagar's Egyptian identity becomes even clearer when we examine the cultural and political connections between Egypt and the Levant during the early Second Millennium BCE, a period marked by trade, migration, and the movement of individuals across regional boundaries. Archaeological evidence from sites in the northeastern delta reveals the presence of Levantan populations living in Egypt, while discoveries in the southern Levant show Egyptian artifacts, pottery, and cultural influences, demonstrating that the two regions were deeply interconnected. This context explains how Hagar could have entered Abram's household during their time in Egypt and why her flight toward the Shur corridor reflects a return toward familiar territory. The narrative's depiction of a divine message delivered to Hagar in the wilderness aligns with ancient literary patterns in which marginalized individuals receive significant revelations, reflecting a cultural motif found in multiple ancient Near Eastern texts. The promise concerning Ishmael, including references to his future descendants and their territorial expansion, aligns with documented patterns of tribal emergence in the regions east and south of Canaan, where archaeological surveys reveal settlement clusters, nomadic encampments, and cultural markers associated with groups that later traditions connect to Ishmael's lineage. The description of Ishmael as a figure who would dwell in the presence of his kin aligns with anthropological studies of tribal societies in the Arabian and Transjordan regions, where kinship networks, territorial mobility, and pastoral lifestyles shaped the identity and expansion of emerging groups. Archaeological evidence from the Middle Bronze Age reveals the presence of nomadic and semi-nomadic populations moving across the deserts of the southern Levant and northern Arabia, creating a cultural landscape that matches the narrative's depiction of Ishmael's future environment. The convergence of Egyptian household archaeology, desert travel inscriptions, and regional settlement patterns reveals that the story of Hagar and Ishmael reflects a world shaped by migration, cultural exchange, and the movement of peoples across vast and challenging landscapes. Please consider sharing this video to someone you know if you believe they might find it interesting in watching evidence-based Bible documentaries like this one. With the revelation now uncovered, we move toward a closing reflection that brings this investigation to its final moment. As we step back from the layers of evidence uncovered throughout this investigation, a vivid picture emerges of a world shaped by household conflict, desert geography, cultural identity, and the shifting landscapes of the ancient Near East, all of which converge to illuminate the historical environment in which Hagar fled into the wilderness and received a message that would shape the destiny of her son. The social dynamics of Abram's household reveal a complex environment in which fertility, hierarchy, and identity collided, creating tensions that reflect real cultural patterns documented in ancient texts and archaeological discoveries. The desert journey toward the Shur corridor anchors the narrative within a recognizable geographical landscape, shaped by trade routes, water sources, and the harsh realities of wilderness survival. The archaeological evidence from Egypt, the Sinai, and the southern Levant completes this picture, revealing a world in which individuals like Hagar navigated the boundaries between cultures, regions, and social identities. Together, these discoveries form a mosaic of evidence that does not merely support the plausibility of the narrative, but invites us to view the story through the lens of history, archaeology, and cultural memory. The story of Hagar and Ishmael stands not as a symbolic tale, but as a moment situated within a real and dynamic ancient world. A world whose traces remain preserved in the soil, inscriptions, and migration corridors that continue to speak across millennia.